Well, I want to say to you that this can be a great moment in your lives. It's a difficult and a strange time for us all. But if we use this time well, it can be a great time. Now, you might quickly say that, Father, how can such a sad and restricted time ever be a great time for us? We know that people are sick, people have been dying, and too many people, and people are anxious and alone at this time. And the lives, certainly of young people, have been placed on hold. Yet out of such a time and its evils and difficulties, God can draw a great good for us if we're open to that. I think that would above all be my message to each of you, to use this time to look, to stop, to look, to care for each other, to think and to pray. Pope Francis has called this a time of big choices for us, a time to reset, he says, our relationship with the Lord and with others. And it's true that the public health crisis came for us all as a shock, really. Suddenly in March, the world was at a standstill for us, our lives put on hold, our plans thrown into question, our contacts and movements, all of them restricted. And while we can't compare this with the dangers and deprivations which the wartime generation went through for so many years, we can perhaps, in the same way, look back on this time one day as young people as a moment that was very significant in our lives, a time that will be remembered. Now, a crisis is quite literally a crossroads, and it's a moment of choice for our direction. And at first, of course, this time might have seemed just like a break, and then the monotony of lockdown life was just something to get through. But I'd like you to see this not as wasted time, but a time when all those little choices, what takeaway to have, where to go out, those choices have gone. But the big choices are there before us in life. And it's good, and you can Google this, but to look to that night of the 27th of March in Rome, when Pope Francis stood in a windswept, desolate St. Peter's Square, nobody there at all, but holding the Blessed Sacrament of the Eucharist, the real presence of Jesus Christ, to bless the city and the world as the bells rang out above him. In his message that night, he turned our attention to a vivid scene in the Gospel, and you'll find it in chapter 4 of St. Mark's Gospel. And I'll just quickly read this from the New Testament, that with the coming of evening that same day, Jesus said to them, "Let's cross over to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him just as he was in the boat, and there were other boats with him. Then it began to blow a gale, and the waves were breaking into the boats that it was almost swamped. But he was in the stern, his head on a cushion, asleep. They woke him and said to him, "Master, do you not care? We're going down." And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Quiet now, be calm." And the wind dropped and it was calm again. Then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" And they were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Now they were caught in a storm, and we are caught in a storm just now. And if you've ever been on an aircraft, as certainly I've been, that's been caught in violent turbulence, where the aircraft is thrown about and drops its height and all the rest, you'll know that panic on board is quite blind, and that's not helpful to us at all. But in this storm of the pandemic, we're not being called to panic or to that sort of blindness, even though at times we may be a little disorientated by it all. But St. Mark records that beautiful detail that Jesus was asleep and in the stern, which is the first place in a boat to go down. And even in sleeping, he's teaching us that we have to have that same trust that we're in the hands of our Heavenly Father. We may no longer feel safe and secure and certain about the future, but that rests in the hands of our Heavenly Father. The disciples cried out, "We're going down. Do you not care?" And yet he's shown us where we are cared for always. And he asked that searching question, why is it that you have no faith? Why are you afraid? And Pope Francis said that night that this same question comes home to us at this moment of the public health crisis. We were going, he said once, at breakneck speed, like that boat, thinking nothing can stop us, that feeling powerful, that we can do anything, and suddenly the storm comes and rocks the boat and puts everything into question. And this is a moment for renewed faith in him. That's what he seeks from us. And it reminded me of a moment in World Youth Day in Madrid. You might have been there with me. Father Chris certainly was. And there was a very violent storm, 2 million young people on a big airfield outside of Madrid, gathering to pray with the Pope. And Pope Benedict, who was the Pope then, he stayed, and he was so calm. And he said to the young people and to the bishops as well that this was a lesson for our lives, that when we're in the middle of the storm, it's the time to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. And that's prayer. That's faith. And I'd like to say to the young people or anyone that's listening this evening that this is such a time for us to fix our eyes on him. And that means to pray wherever we may be. And also Pope Francis would add to choose the Lord in this moment of crisis. And prayer is such a gift that 24/7, any moment of the day or the night, we can raise our hearts and our minds to him. We can speak with him, just as the disciples did with those most immediate things in their own minds were going down, they cried. We can share our own hopes, our own fears, as those disciples did. And if you don't know how to begin to pray, then just begin with those words he gave us, our Father. Or, like the first disciples, just tell him what's in your mind, your heart now, and you've started to pray. You've begun the conversation with him. Saint Teresa, great saint, she said that our praying is nothing other than a close sharing between friends, a conversation. Let's make sure that this time allows that conversation for us. And in prayer, we begin to see ourselves, our world, very differently, in a new light, we could say. And this isn't the heightened observation or the heightened awareness of the body or breathing in these kind of Eastern practices which are not prayer. No, we begin to see in a supernatural light. We begin to glimpse things as God sees them, including ourselves. And in a crisis, it's a time of choice for us and of choosing. And I hope for us it can help us put aside selfish plans and limited and rather mean aims in our lives, so that we can look in this time to the great goals of our lives. England's newest saint, John Henry Newman, he reflected that we ourselves can't see what we can best do with our lives, what is our real and true happiness. But God does know, and all that we need to do is to ask Him and to be guided by Him in our lives. And I hope young people listening that this can be such a moment for them. And perhaps for those great Christian vocations of life where He calls us to Christian marriage, to the priesthood, to the consecrated life of women and men, to an apostolic life in the world, wherever He leads us. Know that that's where your happiness and your life will be found. And finally, let's go back to that picture in St. Peter's Square, the 27th of March. The Pope, a tiny figure, alone, but holding the blessed sacrament of the real presence of Jesus Christ. Here at Shrewsbury Cathedral, we have a discernment year, a discernment community for young men considering the vocation to the priesthood. And that is very much about drawing close to the Holy Eucharist in their community life, in the time that they spend here, so that they can be close to Him. They can hear where He is calling them in their lives. And when we see that gift of love in the Eucharist, we are inspired to see that we're called not to give something small in our lives, but to give ourselves totally. And to see that it's not something mean in our lives that we're ever called to, but we're called to something very great when it's God that is calling us. And He'll give us the grace to enable us to do that. And finally, let's look to Our Lady, to Mary. This is the month of May. It's her own month. She's long been honoured by Christians as the star of the sea and the stormy ocean. And in this time of storm and disturbance, let's look to her, who is a point of light, a bright point of light in the family of the Church, and ask her to guide you, to guide us through these days and in the great choices of life, to use this time well. And let's ask her, as the patron of our diocese, Our Lady, help of Christians, to make that way safe for us all. Amen.